Coming up in this episode,
the fact that what I'm doing is making an impact. And even more importantly, for me personally, I feel like a teenager. I mean, my libido, my ability to be able to bounce back from workouts, my immune system, the way I feel when I travel, the way I feel after a hard workout in terms of clinical studies. Yeah, it's a multimodal stacking of a lot of things. And you can't necessarily say what exactly is working, right? Is it the peptide protocol? Is it the red light? Is it the grounding and earthing? Learning how to play handpan and ukulele instead of just sticking to my same old hobbies like tennis or weightlifting and snowboarding? You know, who knows what it is? But ultimately, you know, I think when you stack a lot of these things, you do see a profound impact in terms of the way you feel biologically.
Welcome to the H.V.M.N. podcast. What we do with our bodies today becomes the foundation of who we are tomorrow. This is Health via Modern Nutrition.
All right, Mr. Ben Greenfield, welcome back to the H.V.M.N. podcast. It's really great to have you back on.
Hey, it's awesome to be back.
So last time you were on, I feel like was about almost 3 years ago, and you've probably seen it at the forefront of almost anyone in terms of how mainstream media has talked about and looked at the notion of biohacking. So maybe we'll start super broad. You've seen a lot of these different waves of interest, whether that's focused on longevity or performance. What do you make of the last couple of years when we have folks like Jack Dorsey, we have a popular podcast with him,
who has an eating disorder apparently?
Yeah, so I want to just get your sense in terms of the evolution of how mainstream media portrays our general space here, how much science and credibility has evolved over time.
Like my gut feeling about the way that media portrays biohacking is there's kind of two different angles. They see kind of like the possibly dangerous, more fringe things people might be doing, like injecting chlorophyll into the eyeballs or, you know, putting magnetic implants into the body or, you know, kind of doing the whole old school grinder thing, right? Like using the human body as wetware and the implants or technologies that might be put into the body or placed on the body as hardware. And they'll use that as like a sexy story to point out the dumb things that people do, like whatever self-inflicted CRISPR gene editing and almost like, you know, paint biohacking as being comprised of a bunch of freak, mostly male technology enthusiasts who are out harming themselves by doing unnatural things to their bodies. And as you and I both know, I mean, like that's a pretty small subset of the biohacking population these days, you know, and now biohacking has grown to be such a broad term that you're a biohacker if you put coconut oil in your green tea. You know, you're not a chef, you're a biohacker. And so, you know, now the term is so broad, it's almost difficult to really define what is hacking biology versus what is just taking a few simple steps to make your life more healthy. But I think that the media does like to kind of glob on to some of these more fringe things people are doing and really highlight that. I mean, I've experienced that myself. You know, for example, you know, of course, the whole penis stem cell thing seems to be this topic that comes up over and over again that I can't seem to live down. You know, that I you know did a stem cell protocol for my penis, which is something that's been done for years for things like erectile dysfunction or Peyronie's disease. But because a healthy young male happened to try it out to see what would happen in a healthy person who did it, you know, the media just takes that and runs with it, you know, and I'm painted as the penis guy or the penis biohacking guy. And, you know, that it's interesting because I'm doing so many other things to optimize biology and health span and lifespan, you know, from red light therapy to cold thermogenesis to mitigation of carbohydrate intake, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what the media kind of clings to, is anything that's either controversial or fringe or would make for a sexy story. That's really just how the media works. So that's one thing, is that, you know, we tend to see the portrayal of biohacking really being almost like unfairly shifted towards a portrayal of a bunch of crazy people out doing crazy things to their bodies. Now, on the other hand, on the flip side, we tend to see a lot of people who are health enthusiasts and who care about their bodies doing what, again, now that the term biohacking has become a very broad term, things that in older times would have just been considered ancestral practices or even religious practices or spiritual disciplines, like take fasting, for example. You brought up Jack Dorsey, right? Who is, I think, currently eating one meal a day and using compressed feeding windows. And that's not necessarily something that flies in the face of human biology or even some ancestral eating patterns, having one to maximum of 3 feedings per day versus snacking and grazing all day long. But, when someone's doing something natural like that and it gets out in the media, especially when they're a public figure, the media, they turned around and portrayed that as Jack Dorsey has an eating disorder. And this is going to be dangerous for people who might not be able to get by on just one meal a day. The reporter probably doesn't realize that one meal a day is like, a huge ribeye steak with some roasted carrots and half a bottle of red wine and maybe some dark chocolate coconut ice cream afterwards. And, it's one meal a day.
Load,
the people who successfully do it treat it as though our ancestors would have, when coming upon a hunt or a kill in the wilderness. You eat a lot of food and then you're off foraging again for a long period of time, perhaps with long periods of time not eating between those meals. And, but it's very simple for the media to take something like that and run with it. Or let's say something like, full body sunlight exposure, full body infrared exposure for collagen or elastin production, or even, when used on the gonad, something like increased, mitochondrial activity of the Leydig cells in the testes. You produce more testosterone. We know there's research going back, I think it's all the way back to the 30s or the 40s, showing that, full body sunlight exposure is actually a pretty beneficial tactic or strategy or practice. And yet we see the media just absolutely, seeming to make a huge deal out of people who might be out, sunning their perineum or using big red light therapy devices.
That big meme, I think, over the winter holidays, right, where there's folks like shining, I guess spreading their legs in the sun, right? What were they term it, like butt lighting or butt something like
for perineum tanning, and that's not a practice that I necessarily engage in, but I do make sure that I get a level of sunlight exposure per day without sunscreen that many folks in media and even many physicians would say is going to increase my risk for skin cancer, which it doesn't. It actually decreases your risk for skin cancer. Frequent low dose exposure to UVA and UVB radiation as a hormetic stressor can protect you from skin cancer, and the similar thing could be said for infrared or red light therapy. And so the broad answer to your question is basically the media takes fringe biohackers doing dumb or slightly risky things and paints with a broad brush as that being a definition of biohacking in general. And then they also take ancestral tactics that people are now returning to and paint that as being some kind of also advanced dangerous biohacker disorder, when in fact we're simply trying to overcome some of the evolutionary mismatches that we now encounter in a post-industrial era. So, really, in my experience, those are two ways that I've seen the media portray biohacking.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I want to reflect on those 2 points in the sense that I empathize with folks in the political world talking about fake news in terms of just having these narratives that they want to tell that describe some niches that will drive clicks. Exactly. I think with Jack Dorsey, I think you actually connected me with him around fasting, and the New York Times wrote a crazy article about him on your podcast talking about basically starving himself. And when you actually look at the science, it's actually quite justified by the literature. People, sitting in a journalism room just want to tell these fantastical stories. But my sense is that it's driving broader awareness. I feel like the communities and the interest in these topics are bigger than ever, right? And I would say that what I've seen over the last 5 years has gone from kind of like much more performance, niche, nootropics, or microdosing LSD stories to then talking more about fasting and more ancestral practices. And I would say that within the last year or so, a lot of it's focused now around anti-aging and longevity. You really are tying ancestral best practices, things like fasting, but also more I guess, speculative things like grounding, earthing, plant-based medicines, meditation. But you also are very cutting edge with things like stem cell injections. And some of those things are so cutting edge that we really don't have randomized controlled trial data or a gold standard clinical trial on some of these interventions. So I'm curious, as you assess all these biohacks, all these interventions, how do you think about the level of evidence for you to try versus you recommending? How do you synthesize and put this together in a holistic framework?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. The first is, early in your question, you kind of alluded to this idea of really a large part of this being an attempt to simulate a more ancestral experience in a largely industrial era. And so when we look at a lot of these biohacks, we're simply taking what we'd normally experience in nature and kind of fighting that uphill battle against all these evolutionary mismatches we're surrounded by to simulate that in our offices or in our homes. So, sure, you could go outside barefoot or lay on your back with your shirt off in a park and be soaking up the negative ions that we know the earth delivers. But if that's not something that you're able to do, you can, purchase some biohacking device like a grounding mat or an earthing mat or a pulsed electromagnetic field device set at 7.8 hertz or so, and deliver those same frequencies when you're asleep, 8 floors up on a high-rise condo, or standing in your office in which you're not even on a ground floor with a conductive concrete surface. Or you could say, realize the benefits of some of the infrared and red light spectrum that we get from sunlight, yet if you're unable to get out into the sun due to your job or due to your night shift or whatever the case may be, you can use near infrared or red light panels or light producing devices to simulate that in your own home or in your office. You might not live in an area where you could experience the same type of fluctuations in temperature that your ancestors may have. Maybe you're a Northern European living in LA, right? And so you can take advantage of things like a cryotherapy chamber to get that same type of cold thermogenesis response because you simply aren't out in the snow and the rain and the cold. The same could be said for heat, right? Maybe you don't have a physically demanding job where you're out sweating and producing heat shock proteins and building fences and lifting rocks and gardening or hunting or foraging in the midday heat. But perhaps after your gym session, you're able to hit the sauna, catch up on an audiobook or a podcast or a magazine, and get that same heat producing effect in that environment. So many of these biohacks, we're simply attempting to simulate what we might be able to get from ancestry. And I in no way would say that if we have access to all these technologies, we should not be outside barefoot or in the sunlight or, on a cold day going for a walk outside rather than visiting a cryotherapy chamber. But, the realistic fact is that, in many cases, we're not able to get out and do some of those things depending on our circumstances or jobs or time, et cetera. So I think some of these technologies do a very good job mimicking nature. Now, my second thought regarding your question is, it is true that the issue with some of these biohacks is that there aren't any randomized clinical trials or good controlled human trials on, let's say, something like, what would happen if a healthy young male were to inject stem cells into his genitals. In a case like that, sometimes you have to look at the existing literature on less well populations who have done something like that and establish any risk parameters after reviewing the literature. And, in other cases, when we're talking about, let's say, anti-aging and longevity, in many cases, we're looking at multimodal approaches, right? It's very similar to Dale Bredesen's book, End of Alzheimer's. It's difficult to build a large, robust human clinical study around his approach, which has been proven to be beneficial anecdotally, but involves hyperbaric oxygen, fish oil, ketones, vinpocetine and other blood flow enhancers, intermittent fasting, infrared and near light frequencies, intranasally or over the head, all these different modes that when stacked are effective, but when in isolation don't appear to be as effective. And so if you look at anti-aging and longevity, sure, we know if you increase your sirtuin intake, your NAD intake, pay attention to your mitochondrial health, and perhaps even use peptides, such as epitalin or MOTS-c or H.V.M.N as calorie restriction mimetics, and use something like exogenous ketones to enhance NF-kappa B pathways. Like, we know that all of these things stack to address multiple mechanisms that contribute to aging, yet there's not any big studies that stack them all together and say, well, here's what happens in humans, from the age of 30 on up to 90 when using these strategies. So there is quite a bit of extrapolation that occurs. And, as simple as it might seem, for me, once I've looked over the data on any given strategy, whether it's photobiomodulation or ketosis, and I've evaluated any risk for those, at that point, I'm pretty willing to try something out, but I won't make any claims that, stacking these 8 things together is going to have X effect, because you simply can't say. What I can say is you can look at anecdotes, right? And, for me, coming from like everything from, Ironman triathlon to bodybuilding and, deep dark forums where people are reporting on, what dosage of methylene blue worked for them, or how they felt when combining intermittent fasting with cold thermogenesis for fat loss. You're simply looking at anecdotes from collections of people who are talking about these things, trying things out and seeing what works for you. But for me, it's always with the caveat that I do go to the literature, and I don't just review the literature abstracts, but I dig into the full studies, because, for example, 80% of the research out there is done on male models, male human models, male rodent models, et cetera. And if I'm working with a female client who's asking me about the appropriateness of a 16-hour intermittent fast for her, and all the data shows that to be beneficial for men, but then once you dig in, there's some endocrine dysregulation that occurs with women, then you can actually be a little bit more precise with the application of the research. And, for me, it's a little tricky, because a lot of these journals aren't open source, and it can get pretty expensive to get access to them. I have one. I probably shouldn't share it on air. Maybe I'll share it with you after the show, but there is one website that allows you to pretty much get free access to every journal. It's kind of a little
gotta find an academic affiliation so you can get someone
on your browser.
Yeah.
But
okay.
If I say it on the podcast and everybody gets a hold of it, it might disappear pretty soon or get shut down.
Yeah.
But there are little ways to get around getting access to the full text. But I think looking at the methods, looking at the subjects, and digging into a little bit more than just the abstract can be pretty beneficial as well.
Yeah, I think that's a quite sensible approach. I mean, I would say that I started off in this space much more conservative, right? Because I think if you talk to very classic professors at institutions, they'll just say, hey, there's no RCT human data on the population. It's all kind of speculation. But I think as you actually, and in your case, right, you have clinical experience working with specific clients or patients and whatnot, or you work with athletes. And I think in our case, working with specific high-end performance use cases, you start building up these anecdotes or these case studies one at a time. And you're seeing that these protocols, you're seeing data. They might not be a controlled data set, but there's clearly some signal there. Doctors like Jason Fung putting thousands of people through fasting procedures to reverse or control their diabetes, or you have strong anecdotal folks like Michaela Peterson talking about our carnivore diet really resolving autoimmune issues. And to me, it's like, yes, these are not RCTs, but they seem like credible people. I don't think they're lying about their N equals 1 experiment. And I think there's something to extrapolate from there. So it's, yes, I think use the literature, use the RCT data to really understand our best understanding of the mechanisms. And then I think at the cutting edge, how do you take some of these anecdotes or these case studies or these N equals 1s of people really pushing limits?
And quantify. I mean, we live in an era where the same test that executives would have had to have paid tens of thousands of dollars to Princeton Longevity Institute a decade ago are now accessible to us in the comfort of our own home. So not only can we track in real time HRV pretty accurately using wearables, along with sleep cycles, along with resting heart rate, et cetera, and get a running parameter every single day of how some of these strategies are affecting our nervous system or our sleep cycles, or, if you're in the case of something like a continuous blood glucose monitor, your glycemic variability. But I mean, I quantify pretty regularly. I mean, I do a quarterly blood panel, typically a quarterly up to a yearly gut panel. I run my DNA pretty extensively through, the increasing number of DNA analysis platforms that are out there. I do a urinary hormone test on a quarterly up to a yearly basis. Yeah. I will typically do like a blood micronutrient evaluation as well, like a NutriVal, about once a year. So I'm getting access to a lot of data. And anytime I throw in something really considerably new, like let's say I'm going to use, like one of the things I talk about in my book are some of these telomerase activators, and I'm going to spend money on something like, TA65 or TAM818. Those are not small investments. I'll do something like a SpectraCell telomere analysis, use that protocol for a few months, and then retest to see if that's something that's going to stick with me. And at the same time, when I'm getting blood analysis of inflammatory markers or endocrine regulation or thyroid regulation, it allows me to also see if there's any deleterious or negative side effects from those strategies. So I think quantification is really important too, if you are going to treat yourself anecdotally and experiment with some of these things that don't have robust human clinical research behind them or randomized trials.
Yeah. Again, I want to go back to like, how do you integrate kind of the notion around we want to mimic our best ancestral practices, but obviously our caveman ancestors weren't using telomerase activators or sirtuin activators.
Right.
Is there a threshold that kicks off the evidence? Is there a hard, fast rule for you? Is there a heuristic that you really focus on? Or is it case by case? You look at any specific intervention, you talk to the specific expert that's been studying this and decide from there.
It's the latter. Okay. The only heuristic that I address, especially for people who reach out and like, well, what do I choose? You talk about so many things, where do I start? It's always with the foundational principles, right? Holistic nutrition and movement, and then basically addressing the body, very similar to what, Robert Becker initially outlined in his book, The Body Electric, and which has since been, fleshed out by everyone from Gilbert Lean to Michael Hamblin and a lot of these researchers who look at the electrical potential of the human body that you can find a lot of really good studies behind. But this idea of treating the body as a battery, I think if you have nutrition and movement down, you then move on to basically some of the things I already mentioned: grounding and earthing, sunlight and photonic energy, heat, cold, water, and minerals. Those are essentially the 6 variables that are the most important in terms of maximizing the electric potential of the human body, maintaining a negative charge within the cell, positive charge outside the cell, maintaining proper movement of fluids throughout the body. And I really think that's the place everybody should start. Once you've got those foundational principles in place: nutrition, movement, earthing, grounding, light, heat, cold, water, and minerals, then you can move on to some of these more advanced parameters, like let's say, NAD IVs, or the use of peptides, or some of these are the more fringe or more expensive things. But I think you always have to start with the foundational principles.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one thing that I've been puzzling a lot about is this notion, what I call the human zoo, that most of us living in a modern culture essentially are in boxes: our house, our office, maybe our gym. You have these 3 boxes that you just commute between with a smaller box. And right. All these things that you're talking about.
Or tubes, if it's an airplane, it could be a tube.
Right. And a lot of the things that I think you're talking about essentially just pull you out of that context. I mean, you're basically on a treadmill right now. So you're not just on your butt talking on a screen. You're actually doing some sort of ambient physical exercise at probably zone 1, zone 2, just chilling. But like you're going to put in 60, 90 minutes of cardio.
I'm in zone 4 right now, bro. There's lactic acid coming out my pores. You're crushing me.
Yeah. I've been curious about just around the cultural and media perception. And I think you touched upon this, was this notion that it's all just a bunch of alpha males or a bunch of men doing biohacks. This is like a bro culture. And you're referencing some of your female clients. And I think that's like actually an astute point that, yes, most clinical trials are done in human men. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting topic in terms of how we update research culture. It's usually human white men done in, in institutions. There might be, sex differences and
it's also right now. Last time I checked, it's like 65 to 70% of the researchers also are men.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting from I think commentary on how we maybe provide advice or advice to fix the systems. But I'm just curious in terms of, is this like a tech bro movement? I mean, what do you see from the ground up? I think, we're referencing this a little bit before, but, I would say a lot of women are just as interested, if not more interested, in a lot of these techniques and behaviors. And in some sense, the women were the original biohackers, having to track their hormonal cycles, their periods, and try to figure out their nutrition and not have cramps and whatnot. So again, there was a nice Sunday Times London article describing you as an alpha male of alpha males, I guess, preaching to this group of men,
which I'm not, by the way. I mean, I grew up playing violin, president of the chess club, total World of Warcraft nerd. I wanted to design video games and be a computer programmer, and kind of, morphed myself into this jock alpha male type of person. But if you were to come and hang out with me for a day at my house, you'll find me, crying while I'm reading an Anthony DeMello book, snuggling with my kids, playing the ham pan, and making kefir in the kitchen. And a lot of people think I run around all day swinging kettlebells in the forest and climbing ropes, and that's more of what the media has portrayed me to be. But I'm definitely not an alpha male's alpha male. I'm a pretty hopeless romantic. But that being said, I do think that men seem to, and I'm sorry if I'm stereotyping to the females listening in, but it seems like men tend to be more interested in tinkering with technology, in playing in the realms of science. And I think that's just leftover from thousands and thousands of years in which women were really relegated to a role of you stay at home, you do the gardening and maybe some of the planting, a little bit of the foraging, take care of the children. It's some of that might still be kind of epigenetically, even from a microRNA standpoint, built into the female psyche. Men just tend to be early adopters, more willing to go out and do things that might kill them, tinker with technology, be interested in taking things apart and putting them back together. And even when you look at little boys versus little girls, you still see some of those elements still left over. I'm not necessarily justifying that that's the way society should be built, but I do think that just based on the way humans have operated for thousands of years, some of that's still left over in our epigenetics, in terms of what we're naturally inclined to be interested in. So yeah, I think a guy's probably more prone to rush out, grab some infrared helmet for their head and put it on while they're at work, while they're standing on some electrostim mat, versus a woman. It just seems like men tend to be a little bit more willing to possibly go out and do dumb, stupid things or play around with technology in strange new ways compared to a lot of women. At the same time, you make a very good point. This whole world of biohacking has a really unique kind of female potential bent towards it, in terms of everything from urinary tracking for progesterone and LH to determine fertility cycles, to altering your exercise, your lifestyle, and your nutrition based on which of the 4 phases of your cycle that you're in, to really addressing some of these parameters that are unique to females, even intermittent fasting protocols and compressed feeding windows. We know women, based on the down regulation of kisspeptin hormone in response to about 12 hours of intermittent fasting, tend to see some decreases in gonadotropin releasing hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, fertility, bone density, et cetera, especially if they're lean and active with extended fasts, right? So a lot of these biohacks are going to change from a female to a male. And I realize it's called fasting a biohack. It's not, but that's the terminology being used these days. Yep. It's a biohacking eating disorder. But anyways, yeah, things are different between females and males. And I think also a big part of this is if you look at a lot of the leaders of the biohacking movement, right, like Kevin Warwick and Dave Asprey and Peter Diamandis and Peter Thiel, some of these people who are big thought leaders in the movement, they're all males, for the most part. That's painting with a broad brush, but I'd approximate, back pocket approximation, maybe like 80% of the leaders in this movement are males if you're like Google famous biohackers or whatever. So I think that's part of it too. And again, I think that returns to just the early adopter stereotype that men kind of tend to fit into.
I think there's a growing, perhaps less vocal cohort of women that are more and more keen and interested in these subjects and these topics. I think it very much applies to them, right? I've had female friends ask about, the infrared light for collagen production, for beauty, right? I think there's been so many protocols that might not be described as biohacking that are essentially using similar techniques like infrared light for skin health,
right.
etc.
Yeah, I mean, like my wife is using like colostrum clay masks now and combining that with infrared therapy for her skin health. And for her, like this world of like beauty biohacking is something that's very interesting to her. But I also might be a little bit biased because she's not very interested in most of the shit that I do. Like, you talk about evolutionary mismatches. I'm inside of my computer shining red light in my balls and standing on a grounding mat, and I can look out my office window, and she's like pushing a wheelbarrow around the yard full of alfalfa to go feed the goats and chickens, and building a rock wall out in the raised garden beds, and then going off to play tennis outside with her girlfriends. And I'm stuck indoors, and so sometimes I get jealous of her slightly more ancestral lifestyle while I'm fighting all these evolutionary mismatches.
Yeah, it's well said in terms of we want to get to the same place, but there's a little bit different techniques to get there. Another point that I thought was interesting from the Sunday Times article was this notion that beyond just being a coach and a thought leader in terms of just like kind of the physical interventions around, nutrition, sleep, fitness, it's also the emotional and almost, I would say, almost like establishing a philosophical framework for other people. Podcasts are becoming increasingly more and more popular, like these long-form conversations. You see David Goggins. I think you're a good example as well of just having a certain aesthetic of how to live a well-lived life. And to me, it feels like these influencers, these folks on YouTube, these podcast hosts are replacing what used to be the pastor or these religious figures, religious leaders that used to be part of our normal everyday life, right? Religion has become less important in terms of establishing a philosophical framework of how to live a moral, well-lived life. I see like a trend of these YouTubers or influencers, these podcast hosts coming in, kind of filling that gap and void.
Mm-hmm.
You have a sense of the aesthetics of what a well-lived life looks like. And I feel like part of the popularity of folks like yourself is that you're giving a framework, a roadmap of how to do that for other people. Does that seem like overdone? Does that seem like a broader trend?
It is somewhat accurate. The first thing that comes to mind is just based off of kind of like the corner that I've painted myself into in terms of how I operate as a consultant and as a coach, is there's a little bit of a paywall. Like, I'm not inexpensive to work with these days. And so a lot of people who will come to me for coaching or consulting, they're high-end executives. They're people who have access and already own a lot of these biohacks. They're people who are already, getting NAD IVs and, sitting in a hyperbaric oxygen therapy chamber. And it's kind of funny because I'll get some intake forms, from these folks who are independently wealthy executives, and I'll be like, well, how much time per day do you have to be able to devote to, some of the body upgrading, the biohacking, the exercise, et cetera. And I'll say, well, I've only got about 4 to 5 hours on any given day to be able to take care of my body. I'm like, 4 to 5 hours? Holy hell. They're in a pretty fortunate position. And yet once I get down and start talking to a lot of these folks, they're unhappy, they're unfulfilled. Some of them are on antidepressants. Many of them are divorced. Many of them have relationship issues or are estranged from their children or their parents. And there's a great deal of searching for happiness and fulfillment. And it just so happens in the sector in which you and I are operating, people are searching for that happiness and fulfillment through upgrading their bodies and their brains, through biohacking, through supplementation, through exercise, sometimes through masochistic physical events like a triathlon or a marathon or a Spartan race. And, I talked about foundational principles for the body earlier when I was talking about the body electric, but man, oh man, the most important thing that I find myself increasingly emphasizing not only on my own podcast to my audience, but to my private clients, is the importance of the spiritual disciplines as a path to ultimate fulfillment and happiness. That one neglected part of us that's often shriveled and shrunk up because we're not caring for it, the spark inside of us, our spirit and our soul. What is that fed through? It's fed through relationships, love, family dinners, a gratitude practice, a meditation practice, some kind of hope or belief in a higher power or part of a religious body or a prayer practice in many cases, a focus on charity and service in the local community and taking time out to do that. And if you look at, authors such as Richard Foster is a perfect example. He has wonderful books out there about the spiritual disciplines. You find that once you begin to weave these in, and now when I'm writing out programs, it's like, 15 minutes morning gratitude. And here's where you do your 20-minute meditation practice. And it's no longer just about the body and the brain. It's about the spirit as well, because that's where the ultimate fulfillment is derived. And everything else is really just an attachment, right? And again, I'll mention him a second time, Anthony DeMello, in a book like Awakening, he goes through this very, very elegantly, how once you can let go of that persistent, almost placing on a pedestal your own health at the detriment of your relationships or your spiritual health, once you can let go of that and recognize all of those things are simply attachments that don't actually bring you joy, and you can simply immerse yourself in these activities for the mere pleasure of immersing yourself in them and not because you expect them to bring you ultimate fulfillment and happiness, I think it's a far healthier way to approach this really ultimately and admittedly fun sector of toying with human biology, of feeling better, of having better cognitive health, of having, better aesthetics. So whatever, maybe you take pride in looking good with your shit off at the beach, and that's great. Take pleasure in that, but understand that that's fleeting. That's an attachment. And the best thing that you can do, the number one thing you can do, the most lofty of goals would be to care for your spirit. Once you care for your spirit, and that's really your only attachment, you let go of all these other attachments, then I think you're set up to live a far more fulfilled life. And you run into a lot fewer of these issues with people just, on this constant struggle and search for the next body and brain enhancement tool that's going to bring them ultimate happiness and fulfillment.
Yeah, I think it's well said. It's an interesting perspective because it's not obvious that focusing on quantified self in physical or cognitive performance leads to thinking about spirituality. But but if you think about it one layer deeper, that's a level of self-awareness that I would say most people don't have. They don't ever introspect. How do you even quantifiably improve yourself? So in some sense, this notion of
the people that do, to interrupt you, sorry, the people that do, right, so there are two things. They're lucky. They hear a podcast like this, or they pick up the right book at the bookstore, and the light bulb goes on, and they realize, oh, there's something more fulfilling than this. But what you find the majority of the time is, I got cancer. I had a stroke. I had a heart attack. I ran into a wall. My adrenal glands quit producing. Like these things that people run into, and it's when they hit the wall that they realize, oh shit, what I've been doing is actually not what I should have been doing. Yeah. But I'm trying to bring that message to the world so that less people get hurt or go so long without fulfillment and wind up sick or injured, and instead simply progress into a healthier pathway naturally through this journey of self-discovery and enlightenment.
Yep. And I think the tools of quantified self and tracking it's a nice system to allow one to actually attack some of the broader, less quantitative concepts like spirituality and a life well lived, especially with the rejection of like the standard media clips. I feel like there will be more importance for these types of conversations to help inspire people to really introspective around what a well-lived life means and how to achieve that. I want to move on to Boundless, your new book. I think it just came out officially the last couple of days. Congratulations.
Yesterday at the time of this recording.
Yeah. What inspired you to make this latest edition of the book? And then I think there's a lot more technical things that we can kind of dive into. I already have some audience questions on specific little advices and little measurements already.
Look, when I shopped this book to all the big New York publishing houses, everybody turned it down because I wanted to write a comprehensive human blueprint on mind, body, and even spiritual optimization, and also include, fringe things like, sex, orgasm, psilocybin, LSD, a lot of these things that some people also kind of steer clear of or want to dumb down. Then it really is just like a cookbook for the human body, brain, and spirit, for immunity, gut, digestion, performance, fat loss, anti-aging and longevity chapters, like 180 pages in and of itself. And then I took all the work that got cut, over 450 additional pages, put them on the website for people to be able to access, along with over 3,000 scientific references, every article, every podcast, every book that I recommend for people to take a deeper dive in anything that they discover in it. So far, the initial feedback is people are getting out of it exactly what I wanted them to get out of it. A big, fun adventure that you can use for years to come to optimize yourself.
Very cool. One of the interesting taglines associated with the launch of the book is that you've successfully biohacked or optimized your biological age to 9, and your chronological age is 40. So what does that exactly mean? What kind of telomere or epigenetic test or biological clock are you doing to actually assess that 9-year-old self?
That was actually something that appeared not in my book, but in that Times article from the UK, which had a lot of interesting claims in it that weren't necessarily true. About giant bottles of LSD in my refrigerator down around where the kids could grab it, and me popping a bunch of Viagra when visiting Harry Potter with my kids and turning beet red. Like, some of this stuff was taken way out of context, including the fact that I'm 38 chronologically, not 40. And the analysis that I ran was one of the more accurate telomere analysis. There's a lot out there like life length and teleyears, but SpectraCell is, in my opinion, the most accurate right now in terms of the way that they're analyzing telomeres. And that shows a biological age of 9 in terms of telomere length. But admittedly, all the telomere analysis are looking at a small collection of cells, not necessarily at the telomere length of every cell and every organ in the human body. And all it is an approximation. I think that the newer Horvath clocks of actual DNA methylation are more accurate, but those right now, I actually am waiting back on the results from a Horvath methylation clock study that I did. It was over a month ago, so I should be getting the results back soon. That more kind of like predicts timeline of life and when you're going to drop dead, basically. And honestly, I think those methylation clocks are more accurate. But that particular analysis was a telomere analysis. And really, what's more important to me is if those telomeres either aren't changing dramatically in terms of shortening or they are growing longer. And if that's happening, I don't care as much about the actual biological age, whether it's 9 or 18 or 27. I care more about the fact that what I'm doing is making an impact. And even more importantly, for me personally, I feel like a teenager. I mean, my libido, my ability to be able to bounce back from workouts, my immune system, the way I feel when I travel, the way I feel after a hard workout, I just feel really good. So again, returning back to what we were talking about in terms of clinical studies, it's a multimodal stacking of a lot of things. Then you can't necessarily say what exactly is working, right? Is it the peptide protocol? Is it the red light? Is it the grounding and earthing? Is it the incredibly long family dinners that we now have every night? Is it, learning how to play handpan and ukulele instead of just sticking to my same old hobbies like tennis or weightlifting and snowboarding? Who knows what it is? But ultimately, I think when you stack a lot of these things, you do see a profound impact in terms of the way you feel biologically. Whether that's 9, I don't know. I can tell you emotionally, I'm probably that's for sure.
Yeah, I think I'm excited about the technology and the science developing on these biological clocks. I mean, even with the Horvath clock, I think DNA methylation is an interesting data point. But there's also I should with some of the research at the Buck Institute, there's also apparently some tissues that don't track well with the Horvath clock. So even with some, again, like telomere length is an interesting specific data point, but does that describe all of aging? Probably not. It's going to be a multitude of factors that describe aging.
I get into like 12 different parameters in the longevity chapter of the book, like hand grip via dynamometer, walking speed, resting heart rate variability. Then you have telomere length, you have methylation, but there's a variety of things. I mean, deadlifting weight with a hex bar. Like there's a lot of different things that you can track.
Yeah, and I think some of the functional strength markers just seem a lot more intuitive, right? Okay, you actually have grip strength. That's a really understandable sign rather than some DNA methylation tag or some random telomere length. And
VO2 max is another VO2 max and lactate threshold. Right.
Moving on to experimentation. Are you doing anything that's new today? I know that you've done some experiments with the carnivore diet. That's been pretty popular in the last year or two. I think you see my friend Dr. Cameron Seppa talk about dopamine fasting. There's a cycle of media coverage on this notion of dopamine fasting. I think we saw the carnivore diet go from fairly niche, and then the Petersons blew it up into some mainstream kind of discussion topic.
Yeah.
Are you experimenting with anything? And if you can make a prediction, what are some of these things that are happening now that mass media will pick up and talk about as some crazy thing in 2 years?
It's probably three interesting things I'm doing right now. First three that come to mind would be filtering the blood. And there are a lot of good regenerative medicine docs now who are not only using 10-pass ozone, where you actually pass your blood out, you're sitting there working on your computer or whatever, and then it's treated with ozone, which can do things like address mold, mycotoxins, biofilm, Lyme, et cetera, and then passed back into your body after it's been ozonated. So that's called 10-pass ozone. But now there's a newer protocol that kind of closely mimics what something like a young blood transfer would do, but without the $50,000 price tag. And that one's called ozone dialysis, in which the blood is drawn out. It's ozonated, but then it also passes through essentially what's very similar to like a kidney dialysis filter, and then back into the body. And there's even like a bucket kind of underneath the filter. That's fun to look at when you get into the protocol, because you can see all this crap collecting in the bucket, everything from lipid particles to biofilms, and then the clean blood. And you can see a distinct difference in color between the blood coming out of one arm and the blood going back into the other arm. And you feel like Superman afterwards. So I'm pretty keen on ozone dialysis right now. And I'm also excited because the doctor who I work with on that he's going to be at my house on Friday. And another area that I think is going to continue to explode in popularity and efficacy for people is peptides, right? And most of the research for these come out of Russia. One fascinating human trial showed decreased all-cause risk of mortality from nearly every chronic disease that exists, diabetes, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, with just a couple 10 to 20-day protocols of the peptide epitalon.
How long were they tracking people for?
Subcutaneously injected peptide, years. Look up the research of Dr. Khvinson, Khavinson. Fantastic epitalon research. And there are a few others that, as calorie restriction mimetics or inducers of mitochondrial biogenesis, work similarly. Particularly H.V.M.N is one, and MOTS-C is another, MOTS-C. There are peptides also for the brain. I used one this morning because I was up till about 3 a.m. last night with this book launch, just putting out fires and taking care of everything. And we know that lack of sleep can induce some blood-brain barrier leakage and decrease integrity of the blood-brain barrier. And there's one thing that really helps with that barrier, and it's a transdermal peptide you apply in your carotid arteries on the other side of your neck called dihexa. There's one also that acts similarly that's administered intranasally, very useful for TBI, for concussion, as a nootropic, et cetera, called CMAX. Right, so there are peptides for the brain. There are others for healing tissue extremely readily, like injectable BPC 157 or TB 500, the former for inflammation, the latter for things like collagen, elastin fibers. And this whole world of peptides, I think, is very exciting. A lot of really good docs now are getting certified through something called the International Peptide Society. And you can now go there, find a directory of practitioners who are well-versed in peptide protocols and who have access to actual amino acid sequencers for peptides, which is important because most of the cheap stuff you buy online is basically created by feeding E. coli a certain medium. And then essentially the E. coli are pooping out peptides. And the reliability of those and the actual accuracy of the amino acid sequence is questionable. But if people want to get into peptides, I recommend you go to the International Peptide Society, look up a doctor through there who's working with a good company like Tailor-Made Compounding, for example, to get good peptides. And then in a world of constant stress, in a world where, I've got an hour-long flight and I just need to knock myself out for a quick 20-minute nap on a plane. I've been using this in the hyperbaric oxygen chamber as well for a nap in there. You can use it to decrease stress during the day. The idea of vagal nerve stimulators, I really like. Typically, a stimulator is placed over the temporal lobes or just behind the ears that elicits a signal that activates the parasympathetic system via the vagus nerve for very quick relaxation. Something like the Circadia Fisher-Wallace device or the New Calm device to actually deliver an electrical stimulus to calm the vagus nerve. And when I track my HRV with that, it is one of the best ways to increase HRV extremely quickly and to relax the body. And, we know the vagus nerve is toned through chanting, singing, humming, meditating, cold water exposure for the face and the head. But I really like the use of some of these technologies to just stimulate it very quickly to induce a rapid state of relaxation. All that being said, I think in 2020, one of the main things we're going to see more and more of, something that already took off in 2019, and something I've already alluded to, is photobiomodulation. I mean, again, look up the work of Dr. Michael Hamblin on PubMed. Look up the resources on websites like the V-Light website or the Juve website, and the use of near infrared and red light therapy to induce activation of cytochrome C oxidase and mitochondria, to induce nitric oxide release, skin health, an endocrine response, etc. I'm increasingly impressed with what I see with photobiomodulation, and so I think that's going to be something, kind of like keto and CBD was last year. I think that'll be big in the sector this year.
All right, we'll put that down as a prediction. I think that's a pretty good one. I know we're out of time here, so we got the Boundless book. Again, congrats on the launch. Any events, any conferences that you might be going out to in the next few months?
I've increasingly switched all my computers to the Brave browser, which is full on, open source. It's faster than Chrome anyways, and doesn't track in the same way. And I'm increasingly using DuckDuckGo and Quant as my search engine, just because it doesn't censor health data in the same way. But you could find me on Google if you had to. The book's at boundlessbook.com, and my website, most of my social media handles are Ben Greenfield Fitness.
All right. Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks for being back on, and a lot of food for thought here. I'll be back on soon.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
If you're interested to learn more about H.V.M.N., visit www.hvmn.com/pod. Thank you for tuning in.